Namaskar friends and welcome once again. In this particular lecture we are going to talk about one of the much sought after skills in the modern times. Friends, as humans we are expected to be superhuman in order to stand out in the competitive world that we are inhabiting today. And that is why the people who are capable of multitasking and can simultaneously perform so many tasks are always one of those people who are sought after. So, multitasking, while it is a very important and integral part of our modern organizational culture, it also leads to lot of cognitive overload leading to fatigue, mental background breakdown or physical breakdown. So, how can we look at it from the ancient Indian tradition? Because even in ancient Indian tradition also there are instances where multitasking has been treated as one of the important skills. But then rather than leading to cognitive overload or physical and mental fatigue, this has been considered a skill to be mastered over time. So, let us look at that and try to find out how this multitasking can be made meaningful without its harmful effects in our modern organizational culture. So, Śatāvadhāna, what is that? The art of multidimensional attention. In classical India, practices like Śatāvadhāna and Sāhitya Avadhānam, they were not merely spectacles of intellectual virtuosity, but highly disciplined demonstrations of what a trained mind could achieve under structured conditions of attention and memory. So, let us look at these two concepts related to multitasking, and they will certainly give us some idea how people used to achieve it during the ancient times. An Avadhani would typically sit before a group of questioners who were called pruchakas, each posing a different challenge. So, you can just imagine there is one sitting space where a person is sitting in the middle surrounded by questioners, and they are all asking him simultaneous questions. He has to listen to their questions, and these questions are from different backgrounds. So, they are not consistent. These questions are from different domains, and the questioner does not only have to remember those questions, but also answer them simultaneously without losing track of other questions. So, an Avadhani or the person who is responding to these questions would typically sit before a group of questioners, and each posing a different challenge. Some might demand poetic composition under strict metrical constraints. So, somebody would say that can you compose a poem under this meter using this particular line as a reference. Others might introduce numerical problems, somebody might ask numerical question, somebody might ask riddles, or even deliberate distractions such as irrelevant questions or interruptions. So, all sorts of questions will be put. Not only that, some people will be asking irrelevant questions or create distractions as well. Now, the skill is that if you can listen to all these questions and remember them and can answer them one by one without losing the plot, and again even after deliberate distractions or frequent interruptions, if you are able to maintain your calm and the consistency of your answer. So, The performer was expected not only to respond to each prompt in real time, but also to retain every input, track its sequence and return to it accurately after multiple diversions. Now, you can just imagine the kind of skill, the kind of memory, the kind of attention, the kind of training that will be required for this kind of multitasking. What makes this remarkable is not just the quantity of tasks, but the quality of cognitive control involved. Obviously, friends, this requires lot of cognitive control. Well, when you are posed so many different diverse challenges, it is quite natural that you will lose cognitive control and frequently lose track of one while answering the other. But in this sense, it happens as if you have compartmentalized your cognition and are going back to each compartment one by one and taking it from exactly the point you left it last time. The Avadhani does not switch attention in the modern sense of multitasking, rather they maintain a layered continuity of awareness, where each task is held in suspension without being lost, as I said. And you can just imagine the kind of skill that will be required for sustaining this practice. For example, while composing a verse from one questioner, as I said, the questioner has asked you to compose a particular kind of poem on a particular theme in a particular meter. So, while composing a verse from one questioner, the Avadhani simultaneously remembers incomplete lines given earlier by another, keeps track of the order of questions and remains aware of constraints such as specific syllables or themes to be used later. At the end of the session, they are often required to recall all questions and responses in exact sequence, demonstrating not just recall, but ordered structured memory. So, what were the questions? What were your answers? You exactly recall that at the end of the session, and that is possible only if you have ordered it or structured it in your memory. So, in Sāhitya Avadhānam, this complexity intensifies because creativity is added to memory. So, you do not have to remember, you also have to create it using your imagination and creativity. So, the performer must generate original poetry while adhering to grammatical precision, aesthetic coherence and multiple imposed constraints that we talked about, meter, rhyme and other things, all while sustaining awareness of previous prompts. So, you have to remember what people have asked you to do based on the prompts given by them, and at the same time you also have to keep your creativity in action. So, this reveals that memory here is not passive storage, but active, generative and responsive. It operates in conjunction with imagination, that is kalpana, and linguistic skill, suggesting a deeply integrated cognitive system. So, your memory and your imagination and your linguistic skill, they all combine simultaneously to tackle this task. So, such performances challenge the modern assumption that handling multiple tasks necessarily leads to cognitive overload, and you do that without feeling overloaded cognitively, as is the case in the modern times. So, how this wonder, understanding this certainly will help us make our multitasking tasks better in modern times. So, at the same time it is important not to romanticize these practices, as effortless or universally attainable. But friends, let me remind you that what we find in the performance certainly has lot of practice behind it, lot of sacrifice and commitment behind it. It does not happen just like that. So, just thinking that they were superhuman beings capable of such tasks will certainly not be doing justice to this. We need to understand that lot of practice, effort, structured effort must have gone into this kind of a practice. So, they required years of rigorous training, disciplined lifestyle and a cultural context that valued such skills. So, it developed from the system, the cultural context in which these people were born and the kind of disciplined lifestyle they were taught and years of rigorous training. It was not something that they mastered overnight. So, their significance today lies not in replicating the exact form, but in recognizing the underlying principles. We need not to unnecessarily try to accomplish variety of tasks, but rather we need to understand that our modern day workplaces require us to be proficient at several tasks. So, we can learn from this skill and can implement it in our organizations, and we can learn from this practice how multitasking may be possible without cognitive overload or physical fatigue. So, memory strengthens through structured engagement, not random exposure. So, these people had trained their memory and they had trained the memory in a very structured fashion. So, they had their own way of remembering, recalling every movement that they were involved in, and as a result they would not lose track of any of the tasks while performing simultaneously tasks that were in no way related to the earlier task. So, attention can be expanded and stabilized, not just divided. Now, again we talked about structured engagement and expanded and stabilized attention. These two things are very important. Attention, rather than being divided, should be expanded and stabilized, and each task should be looked at with full attention, without of course dividing our attention between the tasks. So, cognition becomes more powerful when integrated with practice and discipline. But then how to do that? Lot of people might find it very funny. Sir, you are saying that without dividing your attention you have to pay equal attention to all the tasks that are so disparate or diverse. Well, that becomes possible only by practice and discipline. So, if you practice discipline and combine the two, practice and discipline, then you will be able to do that. That is Śatāvadhāna and Sāhitya Avadhānam. Śatāvadhāna, in which 100 different tasks will be accomplished by the doer. Sāhitya Avadhānam, we have already seen that there are different people who are giving a lot of prompts, and based on that some kind of literature has to be created, some poem has to be created. They are not simply examples of doing many things at once, but profound demonstrations that memory and attention, when cultivated systematically, can transform the very limits of human cognitive performance. So, friends, if we have to go by these examples, we need to learn one thing, that humans are capable of such acts, but then they need to train their memory and attention, and cultivate it systematically. It cannot happen randomly. Fine. So, such in order to perform multiple tasks and become good at all of them and make seamless transitioning from one to another, you need to practice for years. You need to practice, you need to control your attention, you also need to cultivate that kind of disciplined cultivation of attention, then only this will be possible. Traditional systems of learning, whether in Gurukul traditions, classical philosophical schools, oral recitation cultures, or even pre-digital scholarly practices, they were fundamentally built upon the assumption that knowledge requires time to mature within consciousness. So, if you are just touching upon everything and feeling that you can master it in no time, obviously that maturation time is not there. But earlier it was always believed that maturity of thought, maturity within consciousness comes with time. So, one need not to be in a hurry while mastering a technique. So, learning was not imagined as rapid acquisition, but as a slow internal process involving repetition, contemplation, dialogue and gradual assimilation. A text was not merely covered. Many a time we also hear our colleagues saying that I have covered the topics. Now, covering the topics certainly does not mean the students have really understood it and they can make any use of it. So, a text was not merely covered, it was revisited across years, recited repeatedly, interpreted through discussion and integrated into one's intellectual and ethical life. But just imagine a student in the 5th class is asked to recite one of the poems that he read in class 3 and he says that was part of class 3, now I have forgotten about it. So, what do we do? The learning does not happen just like that class by class, but it is a kind of building that is built over time by putting brick upon brick and each brick has an important function in that. So, in this sense traditional learning systems operated within what may be called deep time, a temporal structure that allowed attention, memory and understanding to stabilize slowly. Contemporary systems by contrast increasingly privilege speed, compression and immediacy. So, there is lot of difference between these two approaches and we have respective outcomes as well. Digital culture intensifies this further. Summaries replace books, clips replace sustained arguments, bullet points replace conceptual exploration. Knowledge is consumed in fragments optimized for speed and accessibility. In such a situation, believing that the learners will have a deep knowledge of something or root knowledge of something seems impossible, because you are consuming knowledge in fragments and that is why you do not have complete knowledge of things. So, this shift produces what can be described as the erosion of temporal depth. Deep thinking requires sustained duration, time for uncertainty, reflection and cognitive struggle. It is only through these processes that we mature enough to master something, to have control over something, or whatever knowledge we gain it with some depth. So, philosophical understanding, creativity and critical reasoning often emerge not from immediate comprehension, but from prolonged engagement with complexity. So, if you look at the knowledge base that this world has created, this has not been created in a day. You might have heard Rome was not built in a day. So, if you want to build a sustaining structure, that structure has to be built with patience, with time, fine. So, however, accelerated systems reduce the space necessary for such processes. Students become trained to move rapidly from one unit of information to another without dwelling long enough for ideas to sediment into memory or insight. So, since they are just touching the knowledge as butterflies, sitting on different flowers, not long enough to have a feel of them, obviously their knowledge base is not that strong. When all learning becomes accelerated, individuals may accumulate information without developing intellectual patience, interpretive depth or reflective judgment. And friends, as a result, while you indulge in multitasking, probably you will not be able to do any of the tasks with the same kind of precision and efficiency. So, one begins to know about many things without truly dwelling within any of them, and this creates a paradoxical condition: unprecedented informational access alongside diminishing capacities for sustained understanding. You will have lot of information, but you will not be able to really make use of that information very effectively, simply because you have just mastered it superficially. So, the crisis therefore is not merely cognitive overload, but the emergence of a culture increasingly unable to tolerate slowness, continuity and intellectual immersion. The pressure to constantly optimize performance often leaves little room for intellectual wandering, rereading, contemplation or slow comprehension. Yet many of the most meaningful forms of learning, philosophical insight, conceptual synthesis, creative thinking, cannot be rushed. So, friends, we need to understand that in order to perform so many different tasks, we need to mature with time, train properly, master them and then accomplish them. So, they require what accelerated systems systematically erode: time to think slowly. Thus, the problem of multitasking is ultimately not just about divided attention. It reflects a larger civilizational shift from depth to immediacy, from continuity to fragmentation and from lived understanding to rapid informational consumption. Reclaiming deep learning may therefore require reclaiming deep time itself. So, we need to understand, dear friends, if we really want to perform a task with perfection, we need to really train our mind, our cognition, give ourselves enough time to test our knowledge under challenging circumstances before we put it to use. So, the most useful lesson from the Avadhāna tradition is that it was built on structured recall under interruption, not on vague better memory. The Avadhāni is tested by multiple prakasas, multiple questioners, partial improvisation and a final return to the full sequence. In some exercises, random letters must be held in a mental grid and reproduced later. That translates into a few very practical drills. So, create a slot map, turn every chapter into numbered positions 1, 2, 3, 4. So, they had developed some kind of technique to remember everything in sequence. After reading, close the book and rebuild the outline from memory. This mirrors the Avadhāna habit of folding items in order rather than as loose fragments. Friends, when we were children, the teachers used to ask us such questions. Tell me, in chapter number 3 what has been mentioned, or they would just give an excerpt and say ki just identify in which chapter does it appear. So, practice return after interruption, stop mid summary, answer a different question, then come back to the original point without rereading. So, Avadhāna performances deliberately tested this ability to resume after divergence. Friends, many a times in modern day cricket matches we have seen that the weather sometimes turns inclement and there are rain disruptions, and immediately after that rain disruption, when the play resumes, the set batsmen get out, and then the commentators always or the experts always say that because of this their concentration was affected. Now, if they only know that such disruptions may be there somewhere sometime during their play and can maintain their attention span and concentration and can come back and again start from where they left it, probably they will be able to go a long way. So, that is why there are some techniques that have been talked about. Say it before you write it. The Avadhāna tradition belongs to an oral performative culture of concentration and partial improvisation. So, reading aloud, reciting and teaching out loud are closer to its logic than silent rereading. And that is why friends, in traditional classrooms we were always asked to recite something as part of memorizing. So, reconstruct this sequence at the end, and then there were frequent questioning from the teachers, what did we practice first, then next, and we had to recollect that, and as a result that helped us structure our cognition that way. So, after studying, write down the points in exact order in which they appeared. The tradition valued not just memory, but ordered memory. So, you do not have to remember everything in any haphazard fashion, rather you have to remember them exactly in the order they have appeared. So, the ability to recover sequence after many interruptions is tested through this. A crucial distinction is that Avadhanis did not rapidly switch attention in the modern multitasking sense. Instead, they developed what may be called layered attention, holding multiple cognitive processes in suspension without losing coherence. Each task remained mentally indexed and recoverable. Now, this is the most difficult thing to master. If we can really master it, many times we are asked to keep our work and personal life separate, which we are barely able to do. Now, this kind of practice will help us in doing that as well, where the work pressure will not impede our personal life, because we will keep that in separate compartment. So, contemporary multitasking often produces fragmentation because tasks compete chaotically for attention. This suggests that cognitive complexity becomes manageable only when the mind develops systems of ordering and retrieval. So, if we really want to train ourselves to accomplish multiple tasks without being overawed by them, then this concept of Avadhāna will certainly help us a lot. One of the most valuable aspects of this tradition for students today is that it treated learning as an active reconstruction process, not passive consumption. So, you do not have to remember everything, rather you have to recreate everything. So, the Avadhani was never merely absorbing information, they were constantly reorganizing, recombining and retrieving it under pressure. So, Avadhana tradition implicitly understood that memory strengthens when knowledge is repeatedly reconstructed from within, not simply viewed again from outside. So, this aligns closely with what modern cognitive science now calls as active recall. So, another striking feature was the use of mental indexing. So, they used to index everything mentally, and Avadhani mentally tagged information according to sequence, category, sound pattern or speaker. That is, speaker 1 asked me to compose a poem, speaker 2 asked me a riddle, speaker 3 asked me a numerical question. So, this is how they used to develop a sequence and keep it in their mind, and accordingly they will get back to each one of them and in the same fashion and answer their tasks. So, the Avadhāna method suggests that memory improves when information is mentally arranged into patterns, hierarchies and associations rather than accumulated randomly. The tradition also emphasized the ability to maintain composure under cognitive pressure. During performances, distractions were sometimes intentionally introduced to destabilize the Avadhani's concentration. The challenge was not only intellectual but psychological, maintaining clarity amidst interruptions. Friends, this happens in our life as well. When the batsmen are batting, the fielders, through sledging, through clapping, they try to destabilize them. Now, it is up to them to maintain their concentration and concentrate on their job. So, in this particular tradition also there were deliberate attempts to disrupt the attention span of the Avadhanis, and they had to show composure and they had to concentrate on what was at hand rather than getting distracted. So, the Avadhana model suggests that focus is not the absence of distraction, but the ability to return to cognitive continuity after disturbance. Another important insight lies in the relationship between creativity and memory. In Sāhitya Avadhānam, memory was inseparable from imagination. The performer had to compose original poetry while simultaneously remembering multiple constraints. In the Avadhāna framework, strong memory actually enabled greater creativity because the mind possessed a rich and stable internal reservoir of language, rhythm and ideas. So, for students, this implies that foundational retention is not opposed to creativity. It can become the basis for deeper analytical and imaginative work. So, the Avadhana tradition also cultivated what may be called slow precision. Accuracy mattered immensely. A misplaced syllable, broken meter or forgotten sequence was considered a cognitive lapse. So, Avadhana reminds us that depth and precision are themselves cognitive skills that require cultivation. So, you cannot master something in a hurry. It requires time, it requires a structured cognitive effort. So, finally, these traditions reveal something profound about the nature of learning itself. The mind becomes stronger not by being constantly filled, but by being systematically trained to hold, organize and revisit complexity over time. This is specifically relevant today when students are surrounded by unprecedented informational abundance, but often struggle with retention, continuity and conceptual integration. So, what do they do? The Avadhana tradition suggests that the real challenge is not access to information, but the cultivation of an inner structure capable of sustaining knowledge meaningfully. So, friends, we can certainly learn from this ancient tradition of Avadhana and Sāhitya Avadhānam by training our cognition, by training ourselves how to hold our attention and cognitive reframing in such a way that disruptions do not disrupt the flow of our task, we can certainly find answers to many of the struggles that we have in the modern times while indulging in multitasking. Again, let us remember that each task has to be well trained, learnt and allowed to mature over time in order to be practiced at a later stage. It does not happen that we learn some skill overnight and we start implementing it the very next day. So, learning is a slow steady process and requires your mind to learn it, structure it and then test it over time before delivering it finally in workplace scenario. So, thank you very much for your kind attention. I look forward to your company in the next class. Thank you.